Welcome to the Sci-Fi Evolution channel. Commander Zora Kronos was renowned for her reputation, and the Orion's 7 stations repair bay emptied as soon as her distinctive black armor appeared in the doorway. The Helios Alliance officer moved with smooth grace, scanning the compartment with tactical awareness, her amethyst-colored eyes always alert. She chose a corner position with a good view of all the entrances and positioned her plasma rifle and sidearm with practiced efficiency. Zora began the process of weapon maintenance, which became both a routine and a ritual for her. The armor on her shoulders and arms bore the marks of recent battles, evidence of a successful mission to rescue civilians at the cost of the lives of 3 good soldiers under her command. The maintenance area gave Zora something that her own living space could not give her: the opportunity to relax and focus on her weapons. It was a place where she could release the tension of leadership and combat and just focus on taking care of her gear. The procedure was systematic and routine, but it also brought a sense of calm and serenity. The mission was a resounding triumph, meeting all the criteria important to the fleet command, and the civilian vessel Star Wanderer escaped damage. All posts, the Viper pirate raiders have been neutralized, and the trade routes in the Krypton system are safe. Zora knew that the burden of team decisions, which save many while sacrificing a few, never gets easier. The main door of the repair bay hisses open, and Zora's hand instinctively reaches for her sidearm. But then she recognizes the unhurried footsteps of the one who is rightfully here. Chief Engineer Ricardo Valenti enters, holding a diagnostic tablet in his hands, with a concentrated expression on his face, which suggests that he is deeply immersed in thoughts about the efficiency ratings of plasma channels, and not about the legendary character of the armored figure in the corner. Unlike the previous inhabitants, Ricardo does not change his course, immediately noticing Zora. Instead, he acknowledges her presence with a curt nod, the same gesture he would make to any colleague, and heads for a row of atmospheric processors that clearly require his attention. Zora watches him work, anticipating the moment when he realizes who she is. She was busy with urgent matters elsewhere, as everyone knew about the incident when Commander Kronos reprimanded Admiral Hagen for suggesting that delays in evacuating civilians were acceptable. The story of the supply officer who was trying to save money on purchasing equipment for her unit was also well known. The pirate captain, who was unlucky enough to call her race graceful but ineffective, learned in combat training that precision is more important than mercy. Ricardo continued his diagnostic work with a measured and competent approach, making small adjustments to the processor calibration settings from time to time. His presence was neither intrusive nor unusual, but simply a professional confirmation that they were both there to do their jobs. After a short pause, Zora realized that she had expected him to speak, ask questions, or acknowledge her achievements or recent endeavors. The fact that she was alone in the maintenance area cleaning guns instead of filling out reports bothered Ricardo. He didn't approve of it. Ricardo finished his work on atmospheric processors and moved on to the plasma channel node, which showed disruptions in operation. He approached the problem with a methodical and unhurried demeanor. Zora admired his systematic approach to problem solving. When he needed a tool, he took it out without hesitation. When it was necessary to adjust the plasma connection, he made the necessary changes effortlessly. For the first time in a long time, Zora felt her shoulders relax a little. The rigid military posture she maintained in public, with her back straight and chin raised, softened into something less aggressive. She was still aware of her surroundings, but the constant vigilance that accompanied command duties felt less intrusive. The temperature controls have been causing problems all week. Ricardo spoke softly, more to himself than to Zora. He did not make any harsh remarks, but mentioned that the environmental systems were working more intensively than they should have. This was not meant as a criticism and did not require a response from Zora. For some reason, It seemed more sincere than many of the conversations they'd had in recent months. Zora did not acknowledge her superiority, carefully avoiding any mention of her reputation. She remained speechless while he questioned her about classified missions and tactical decisions. Instead, she just listened to him talking to himself about atmospheric processors while she calmly cleaned her weapon. Zora found herself absorbed in the rhythm of his work, the quiet beeps of diagnostic scans, the occasional hum of reconfigured equipment, and the pleased sounds he made when the system returned to optimal efficiency. It was a peaceful moment that she had almost forgotten existed, like watching the rain on a window on a quiet evening. When Ricardo finished his maintenance routine and packed his tools, Zora expected him to leave with the same practicality he had shown throughout his work. However, he stopped by his toolbox and looked at the environmental display. "The air should be more comfortable now," he said, still not addressing her directly. The coffee dispenser, however, remained a disappointment. "This is the project for next week." He left without saying a word, and Zora realized that she was holding her breath, not knowing why. The workshop felt different now. It wasn't completely empty, but there was a sense of anticipation in it, as if the space had been prepared for something more than just loneliness. She finished cleaning her weapon and started working on her sidearm, noticing that the environmental systems were functioning more smoothly than before. The temperature felt more balanced, and the air circulation was less noticeable. The peace of mind that good engineering provides without unnecessary pomp. For the first time since the morning battle, Zora took a deep breath. It wasn't the controlled breathing of combat readiness or the measured breathing of diplomatic necessity. It was a breath that allowed tension to escape with the air. Ricardo Valenti, an experienced space engineer, had a theory about Commander Kronos. He believed that the commander should be left alone, just as the plasma channel requires a safe and uninterrupted discharge of excess energy. Ricardo timed his maintenance rounds to coincide with Commander Kronos' presence in the maintenance bay. For the last 3 standard cycles, he had been doing this not because he had any specific plan, but because the atmospheric processors seemed to require attention whenever Commander Kronos was in the repair bay, meticulously cleaning her weapons with the precision of a man deep in thought. Ricardo told himself that it was just a coincidence. On the 2nd standard cycle, Ricardo convinced himself that routine maintenance was the reason for his presence in the repair bay. By the 3rd standard cycle, he admitted that he shared a space with Commander Kronos because she seemed like someone who needed company but couldn't ask for it. Ricardo understood the difference between being alone and being isolated. 15 years in deep space had taught him that there was a difference between silence and a silence that could consume a person. Commander Kronos didn't seek solitude, she endured isolation, and there was a significant difference. Ricardo entered the repair bay with his usual diagnostic tools and a warm cup of coffee. The coffee wasn't exceptional, but it was familiar, and it seemed like it was a choice, not a necessity. As she took up her position, her armor reflected the compartment's lighting, and she disassembled her sidearm with a dexterity that seemed almost instinctive. She looked at his arrival with the same brief recognition she always gave, then resumed her work. Ricardo learned not to fill the silence with empty chatter, so he began his inspection of the plasma channel node, which was experiencing slight fluctuations in operation. The work was critically important. Everything on the space station requires constant attention, but he rearranged his schedule to deal with the compartment systems during their shared moments of silence. The silence that arose was unlike ordinary silence. She had weight and depth, a kind of intense calmness that came from 2 people who decided to be in the same space without demands or expectations. Ricardo went through his diagnostic checklist while Commander Kronos cleaned her weapon. In a way, their separate tasks have become a common occupation, a moment of peaceful coexistence in the midst of a busy space station. Their activities created a harmony that was not explicitly recognized, but both depended on it. Ricardo noticed. Plasma flows more smoothly than a fragment of a star. He was talking more to himself than to her. Sometimes systems just need to be left alone to find their optimal settings, he said. He wasn't sure if she understood the basic philosophy, but her shoulders seemed to become less tense as she gathered her weapons. The commander did not indicate that she had placed it there, but her armor and weapons were already ready for maintenance, which suggests that she had been in the compartment longer than usual. Ricardo accepted the coffee without comment, just as he accepted her presence as a fact that required no analysis or recognition other than quiet acceptance. The next day, the instruction manual was missing, and in its place was a small data chip labeled Helios Alliance Combat Engineering Techniques, Practical Applications. Ricardo connected it to his diagnostic tablet during lunch and found detailed diagrams for atmospheric processor modifications that could improve efficiency by 12% in combat conditions. He realized that they were exchanging experiences, not exactly gifts, but professional resources exchanged between colleagues who respect each other's abilities. It seemed more meaningful than giving gifts because it recognized who they really were, rather than who they might aspire to be. The repair area started to feel different as their routine became more established. Other personnel still provided Commander Kronos with space, but the atmosphere changed from fear of avoidance to respectful acceptance of safe haven. When Lieutenant Parks had to inspect the environmental systems of the compartment, he did it with confidence. Ricardo and Zora collaborated on a military base where rank was not a determining factor, but rather mutual respect. They unwittingly created a unique environment where they could be themselves without even using their names. On the 10th day of their collaboration, Ricardo was adjusting the atmospheric regulator when Commander Kronos approached him. She informed him that the plasma compounds were operating 0.2% below the optimal level. Ricardo looked up and asked about the connection of the main gun. 7. Commander Kronos explained that this discrepancy was not significant enough to affect performance, but she wanted him to know about it. Her explanation was presented with the same practicality with which she approached her engineering work, and Ricardo appreciated it. When you make the wrong decisions, you're the one who gets blamed. Neither of them expected this, but both were necessary. The urgent alarm that woke up the Orion 7 station at 3:47 had a specific pattern indicating that civilian vessels were under attack. A quick military response was needed. All available combat personnel were called in for a deployment briefing. Ricardo recognized the sound from his 15 years of experience at the station, but he had never seen Commander Kronos transform like this. By the time he donned his uniform and reached the hallway, she was already heading for the deployment bay with the speed and fluidity of someone whose nervous system had switched to combat mode. Her armor was perfectly black, every system optimized, every weapon tested and ready. The relaxed figure from the repair bay was replaced by something that looked like a weapon that took on human form. However, Ricardo noticed a detail that others might have missed. Her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted the information display on her helmet. Her breathing was different, more controlled and focused. It was obvious that she was ready for battle. The microscopic tension around her amethyst-colored eyes indicated that she was preparing to make decisions that would haunt her later. 3 civilian colony ships were under coordinated attack by organized pirate raiders, and the deployment briefing outlined a standard protocol that called for immediate intervention to prevent civilian casualties. Secondary objectives included neutralizing hostile forces and securing trade routes. Captain Kronos will command the tactical response aboard the destroyer Meridian with a full contingent of Marines and fighter support. Ricardo watched her take her orders with impeccable military restraint, but he had learned to recognize subtle signs of inner turmoil. Her recognition of the mission parameters was a model of professionalism, but her fingers were tapping on the armor in a manner that he recognized as someone who was engaged in complex calculations beyond the scope of the mission itself. After the briefing, as the staff dispersed to their assigned positions, Ricardo found himself following Captain Kronos as she returned to the repair bay. He didn't want to look like a stalker or an intruder, but he needed to see her one more time before she went to the challenges that awaited her in deep space. She stood in their usual spot, carefully examining the plasma connection of her weapon with a degree of care that seemed to deviate from her usual methodical manner. The weapon seemed to be in immaculate condition, as Ricardo himself had inspected it 2 days ago. Nevertheless, she began to perform additional diagnoses. "Commander," she addressed him by his first name for the first time. "The plasma connection on atmospheric processor 7 registers a 0 reading. The efficiency was 3% below the optimal level, which would not have affected environmental control. However, I thought it was important that you know about this." It was a perfect reflection of their previous technical exchanges, and Ricardo almost smiled. Despite the preparations for combat deployment, she retained their model of practical information exchange. "While you're gone, I'll take care of it," he promised. "Good." She finished checking the weapon and secured her rifle in its magnetic holster with practiced precision. "The coffee situation in this area remains unacceptable, but I will also work to improve it." Commander Kronos turned to face him directly, and he saw something in her amethyst-colored eyes that he had never seen before. Not exactly a vulnerability, but a recognition of a connection, a recognition that their shared silence has become something worth preserving. "Ricardo," she said, "thank you for sitting with me." "Thank you for letting me," he replied. It was more than either of them was willing to admit. She nodded, the same brief gesture she'd given him that first day. But this time it felt like a promise, not just a nod. She then left, heading to the deployment bay with the controlled efficiency that earned her the reputation of a silent storm. Ricardo remained in the repair bay after she left for several minutes, surrounded by evidence of their shared routine. Atmospheric processors running smoothly, plasma channels perfectly calibrated, and the corner where Commander Kronos found space to be more than just a weapon. The station felt different without her. Not completely empty, but unbalanced, as if the main system had been shut down for maintenance. Ricardo threw himself into his work with unusual zeal, updating the systems to make sure they function optimally. Environmental systems that did not require updating, equipment that was already functioning optimally, and a complete overhaul of the coffee dispenser in the maintenance bay. Using components from personal stocks and some innovative engineering that deviated from standard maintenance procedures were part of the 3-week deployment schedule. It was the planned duration, assuming everything went according to plan. Ricardo had been in the Navy long enough to know that tactical operations rarely stick to their original deadlines. However, he found himself counting the days. He missed their conversations, realizing that brief exchanges of technical information had turned into a form of friendship. He missed the comfort of silent communication, the presence of someone who understood that not everything needed to be explained or analyzed. Most importantly, he lacked confidence that Commander Kronos was there with him. Ricardo could put down his protective gear and just breathe. The maintenance area seemed too vast with only one person in it, too quiet without the gentle sounds of weapon maintenance that served as a counterbalance to his engineering work. He started leaving extra coffee for her at her usual place, maintaining the routine even though she wasn't there to appreciate it. On the 18th day, Fleet Communications reported that the mission had been successful. All 3 colonial ships were safely evacuated, the pirate raiders were neutralized, and the trade route was secured. The report was written in standard military language, revealing nothing about the human toll of tactical decisions or the burden borne by officers who had to make impossible choices in impossible situations. Ricardo increased his supply of coffee and made sure that the air purifiers were operating at peak capacity. Knowing that Commander Kronos would need her shelter when she returned, and he wanted to make sure it was ready for her. The repair shop has turned into something much more than just a workplace in my absence. She became a symbol of promise, a commitment to provide shelter for someone who needed privacy but couldn't ask for company. I realized that some relationships are built on grandiose gestures and dramatic statements, but ours were built from simpler elements: shared silence, technical expertise, and the trust that develops when two people decide to be in each other's company without demands or expectations. I was looking forward to continuing this construction upon her return. Upon her return to the Orion 7 station, Commander Zora Kronos arrived with fresh burn marks on her armor and a new heaviness in her gaze. The mission was declared a success by the Navy. All civilian lives were saved, hostile forces were neutralized, and strategic objectives were achieved. However, I had learned to read between the lines of official reports, and I knew there was more to this story. The commander entered the compartment, her movements as graceful and precise as ever. However, there was a hint of exhaustion in her manner that went beyond physical fatigue. She paused in the doorway, surveying her familiar surroundings as if to confirm their existence, before moving to her usual spot with visible relief. The atmospheric processor, 7, is functioning optimally, she noted, starting her work with the tools. A good engineer is distinguished by perseverance. Ricardo responded by continuing his diagnostic work on the plasma compound, which was already functioning flawlessly. The coffee problem has been solved, he said, pointing to the refurbished dispenser. Zora followed his gaze, and a hint of appreciation appeared in her expression. The dispenser was now producing coffee that was simply acceptable, rather than outright hostile to human consumption. This represented a significant improvement over the previous state of the station. This goes beyond the standard maintenance procedures, Zora said. Ricardo agreed. Sometimes systems require more than just standard procedures. They both understood that he wasn't just referring to coffee machines, but rather a deeper level of understanding between them. They resumed their familiar rhythm of working side by side and enjoying the companionable silence. The silence between them was filled with a deeper meaning, a deeper understanding. The trust that was built during our time together. Zora reported that the deployment went smoothly after an hour of quiet weapon maintenance. She confirmed that all targets were completed with minimal losses, which was a textbook example of tactical execution. However, her tone suggested that these textbook decisions sometimes had hidden costs that were not reflected in official figures. Ricardo understood that she was offering him a glimpse into the burden of team decisions made in extreme circumstances, and that she did not expect him to correct, analyze, or improve them with engineering solutions. She just needed someone who recognizes the burden of the decision. It was difficult to make perfect choices with incomplete information, he said, repeating their previous conversation. The best approach is to use the best available data and accept the results. Qualitative data, Zora repeated, this time sounding like a statement of faith rather than a statement of doubt. That's exactly what I told myself when I ordered the Marines to storm the pirate flagship instead of waiting for reinforcements. Ricardo continued his work, letting her words hang in the air between them without an immediate response. Sometimes people need to say their thoughts out loud before they can internalize them, he explained. Zora finished cleaning her weapon and began to assemble it with practiced movements. Thus, 43 pirates were quickly eliminated, instead of potentially surviving longer, and 3,000 civilians were saved who could have died a slow death. Ricardo understood leadership calculations, impossible calculations that weigh certain costs against potential benefits, immediate losses against potential disasters. This is akin to engineering solutions for system redundancy and acceptable failure rates, but with human lives instead of plasma channels. It seems that you used the most reliable information to minimize the number of victims, he said. This is the conclusion drawn from the post-mission analysis. Zora agreed. It was a textbook example of tactical decision-making, efficient resource allocation, and loss-taking within mission parameters. However, 43 people ceased to exist because I felt that their lives were not worth the risk. Ricardo put down his tools and looked directly at Zora, not at her armor or insignia, but at her. The burden you carry is not a disadvantage in your decision-making process. This is a sign that it is working correctly, he said. She met his gaze with eyes that had too much experience to explain. Anyone who can make these decisions without feeling their weight should not be trusted with such responsibility. The fact that you are carrying this burden means that you understand the consequences of your actions. Zora was silent for a few moments, processing this new perspective with the same care she paid to everything else. "Do you really believe that?" "What is it?" she asked. "I saw other officers who were more cautious about their decisions. Victims such as statisticians and engineers who view system failures as mere inconveniences are not the most effective leaders in these fields." Ricardo believed that the most effective leaders are those who never forget that every decision has consequences for real people. There was a change in Zora's manner, not permission, but acceptance. It was the kind of peace that comes from having someone understand not only what you did, but also why it's important. "Ricardo," she said, her voice filled with a warmth he'd never heard before. "I'm grateful for your presence when I needed it, for the silence you shared with me when I couldn't find the words, and for your understanding that sometimes the best helping is just being there." Ricardo smiled. It was the first sincere expression he had shown since its deployment began. "I am grateful for your trust in me," he said. Zora took off her helmet for the first time, revealing her silver hair. Her hair, illuminated by the lights of the repair bay, transformed her from a weapon into a person capable of making tactical decisions. She carefully set the helmet aside, exhaling not the controlled breath of combat readiness, but a breath that allowed tension to dissipate with the air. "The coffee is really excellent," she remarked, sampling the newly renovated dispenser. "Engineering solutions to practical problems," Ricardo replied. "I should probably mention that I may have violated some procurement rules in order to purchase the necessary components," Zora said, her smile transforming her entire face. Plausible deniability is an important team skill. They continued their parallel work, Ricardo maintaining systems that required no maintenance while Zora organized the equipment that was already in perfect order. The repair shop settled into a comfortable routine that felt more like a home than a refuge. They occasionally exchanged brief remarks about technical problems or commented on the inefficiency of the military bureaucracy. But the silence between their words was companionable, filled with mutual understanding that did not require constant verbal confirmation. When Zora was about to leave for the evening, she said, "I want you to know something." "What is it exactly?" "The deployment was easier because I knew that this place would be here when I returned. I knew you'd be here, keeping the systems running and improving the coffee. Without asking questions, I wasn't ready to answer." Ricardo understood that Zora was talking about more than just atmospheric processors and coffee machines. "It will always be here," Zora smiled, with a sincere expression that made him appreciate why the Helios Alliance was considered one of the most beautiful races in the galaxy. "For now, you need it," she added. As she left the service area, Ricardo reflected on the evolution of their relationship. They turned into something he had never experienced before, a friendship based on mutual respect, shared silence, and the trust that comes when two people decide to be in each other's company without any demands or expectations. This friendship was built on the understanding that sometimes the most valuable thing we can offer someone is our presence. In a world filled with noise, expectations, and constant activity, this quiet communication feels like the most precious gift we can give each other.